Welcome to Get on the Ark. I'm your host, Darren Conrad, here with my guest, Matthew Mark Mcwhorter. Do you go by Matthew or Mark?
Matthew's fine. Yep.
Okay, Matthew. And author of Canon Crossfire. And actually, you have several books that you've written.
Actually, there's a different Matthew Mcwhorter. I think that's what you're seeing.
Okay.
I couldn't believe it when I looked into this. He's a Catholic author. He's a psychologist, I think, down in Georgia. So I have to distinguish myself. So.
Okay. Well, but then author of Canon Crossfire, and
yep.
Which is, a fascinating subject, and I love talking about the Bible. I love talking about God, and anything that can do to. What a mystery and what an exciting thing to study. So tell us a little bit, tell the audience a little bit about your journey in faith and where it began and what brought you to seeking out the mysteries.
Yeah, so I was named after the Bible, but was not raised religious. So we didn't go to church, didn't pray, didn't read the Bible, didn't know what was in there. But I always said it was on my bucket list that someday I would read it. And I had major medical problems about 10 years back. And so suddenly, the bucket list stopped being something for the future and became something for the present. So among the books that I had on the list to read were the books I was named after. So I just started with the gospel, started reading them. But even that started me down this journey into the Canon Crossfire, as I call it, is what Bible am I supposed to be reading? Because I was not being brought in by a church. I was not being brought in by a person. So I didn't have a Bible handed to me. I literally went on Amazon and discovered that there's a Protestant Bible, several Orthodox Bibles, a Catholic Bible. There's, for the Old Testament, a Jewish study Bible, for example, that gives you rather different commentaries than a Christian commentary on the Bible. There's different translations. Each denomination of Christianity has its own view of things. And then even within the denomination, there's usually a bunch of different scholars who've written commentaries on the Bible. So I did what I always do, which is, as you can see, I bought all of them, giant piles of books, and started reading them all. So I would read Matthew chapter 1 and just, read it across all these commentaries for a week, and then move on the next week and read Matthew chapter 2. So it took me about 5 years to read the Bible. I started getting interested in the story and I just felt internally, I could see that this was explaining the universe better than all the psychology and philosophy and stuff that I had been reading up until then. And that this, appealed to me if it were true. But the question became, is it true? Or am I just, is this just a story that people want to believe? Is this just something that people say? Or is it actually truth? And that started me down the journey of the second part of the journey, which is the case for Christianity, and trying to figure out whether or not there really is good evidence that, God became man and died on the cross and resurrected from the dead, that miracles occur, etc. Looked into all of that. And ultimately, I would make the decision that Christianity is true and become Christian. But before that, and as part of that, there was this, what I call the Canon Crossfire, that people were telling me, their book is true, their Bible is true. And as part of that, they were saying, well, there's some evidence for these other books that the Catholics or the Orthodox accept, but those books, that evidence you shouldn't accept. And what I noticed is that evidence that they're telling me not to accept is exactly the evidence that they're trying to tell me to accept on the case for Christ. I came to conclude that Christianity and these extra books are a package deal. And the way that I came to that decision was I wanted to know what every single early Christian in the first 450 years of Christianity thought about these books. I tried everywhere, went looking for it. That book did not exist. No one had assembled all of that information for one person to sit down and just read it. That's what my book does. 450 years is, 1 year before 451 AD, which is the first schism among Christians. So this is when Christians are united. What did they all ever have to say about these books for or against? Just wanted to know it, wanted to read it for myself. And that's what I've assembled for anyone now to read. So it's sort of a new foundation for all of these discussions and arguments is you now, over the course of a few hours to a few days, can read for yourself and you will know what every father ever said about them. That was my goal, was to show that for other people. And then we could all make our own decisions and go from there. But that just didn't exist. And for me as a lawyer, I had been a lawyer I wanted to know what all the evidence showed, and then then I'll listen to your arguments afterwards. That's how a judge would make a decision. That's how I wanted to make a decision.
Wow. So what's was there a turning point, like was there a moment like an epiphany or something, a bright light, or
Not at all. Everyone always thinks that. I'm just not that kind of person. I'm a reading oriented intellectual type person, and so it was sort of a slow, hard slog of one tiny piece of evidence on top of another, and then just suddenly looking back one day and saying, "Yeah, I guess I believe." And then I was so uninformed about Christianity. Like I think there was a point where I knew I was Christian, but was like, well, do I really have to go to church? That just seems like a social club. Why would I go join that? Why can't I be Christian on my own? And eventually I get to the epistles and I start understanding why there's a church, etc. And just learning as I went. I actually tell lifelong Christians, I can't believe the life advice that they got in this book that I didn't get. Like, I had to learn all those lessons the hard way. You had it explained to you by Jesus or in the Psalms or the Proverbs, etc. And I didn't get that.
wow. Is there a moment when you look at your life or your journey and then you're like, how did I get here? Like, can you believe that you have this belief now, or that you've
I honestly feel, and I don't mean to be sacrilegious, but slightly divinely inspired, in the sense that it's a weird journey that I was on that led me to a point where I didn't care what the answer was deeply interested in the question, even though I didn't care what the answer would turn out to be, had a lifelong training in how to organize evidence, search through evidence, etc. All that legal training, this particular point in my life, I think it put me in a kind of unique position that people don't seem to be in often, which is, is Christianity true? And which Bible am I supposed to be reading at the exact same time? While having, and I was retired, I had the time to do all this stuff. Like, there's just so much that went into this. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of think God put me here just for this reason, to be in this spot and do this research and give it to everybody. And people will ask, like, when did you decide you had to write a book? And my answer is, actually, I never set out to write a book. I was doing all this research. And then one day it occurred to me, man, if I die without giving all this to everybody else, the world has lost out on an opportunity to mooch off of me. So that's what that's the point where I said, gee, I better put this out there somehow.
So, okay, the question is then, which Bible do you read, or which do you follow?
1,000 steps from here ultimately decided Catholic. But that, as I say, is 1,000 steps from this. This is a preliminary question of what is the evidence for these extra books. But, the book only deals with the Catholic books, but there's still a second decision about what to do in what decision you want to make on the Orthodox, for example. So this book doesn't resolve the Orthodox Catholic split. And then in addition, while I use the word Protestant to mean the mainstream majority Protestant who only accepts a limited canon, there are actually Protestants that accept a bigger canon. And there's other people who have a sort of a vague second category of what they could mean, et cetera. I mean, all of that I leave to the reader. This is the very early stage. What did the early church tell me about these books? Then I'll make some decisions about what I'm going to accept and what's going to go on down the road. So my book's early in this phase, but my ultimate conclusion was Catholic.
Have you seeked out any of the missing books, or the the Book of Enoch or Jasper?
So the Book of Enoch is the one non-Catholic Apocrypha. They're Catholic only because the Catholic accepts them. They're actually Jewish books, right? But the acceptance by Catholics makes them the Catholic Apocrypha. There's only one in addition to that I really discuss in my book, which is Enoch, because Enoch is actually referenced in the Book of Jude, the Epistle of Jude. So it's actually mentioned in the Bible. And exactly how people deal with that, I discussed in the book, but that's some evidence that Jude accepted the Book of Enoch. Whether that means the church should or shouldn't is a separate question. But when you're actually discussing, did Jude accept this book? Like, he's referencing it. And people try to give you a lot of explanations of how, no, he didn't really accept the book. He this, that. Like, that's not Jude's words telling you. Jude's words are, Enoch prophesied, and then he quotes directly from this book in an epistle that is the entire point of his epistle is to argue against heretical beliefs that have infiltrated the church. Why would he be quoting from this other book if he didn't accept it? Like, that's something people got to deal with and wrestle with. And so I do discuss that one, but all those other ones I don't discuss in this book. I just had to cut it off at 550 pages. And don't let the 550 scare you either, by the way, because the narrative portion that you can just read for yourself is a couple hundred pages. The rest is the supporting evidence. You know, you get into that as much as you want. If you're the sort who doesn't want to get into that, don't worry about the 550 pages. But it's still a very readable book, and nothing but 5 stars. Everybody's loved it, including Protestants who totally disagree with me. So,
have you discovered any Bible scholars that you kind of used as mentors or?
Yeah, to be honest, and you know, there's a lot of other books that I could have wrote, right? And I started down that journey at different points. And one of them was to explain how I read all these Protestant scholars, loved what they had to say in certain respects, but ultimately decided Catholic anyway. And so it's sort of like, how did you become Catholic? Like, well, I read a bunch of Protestant scholarship and decided to become Catholic. Is an odd answer. And trying to explain it to people, you know, just spirals out of control. So I can't quite write that book. But in this book, you'll find me. I'm using the best Protestant scholars. This isn't a straw man. I'm showing you exactly what they have to say, what the best-selling books of all time on the canon have to say, etc. This problem is not this problem is that everybody's kind of thinking about it wrong because they didn't do the work of looking into what the evidence actually says. So what you'll find, it's a little bit like in the Bible where it says, you know, you see the mote in the other person's eye, but not the log in your own. What you'll find is that the scholars will say, well, those Catholic books have very little evidence and it came very late. But that's because they didn't assemble all of that evidence to see how much there is, and they didn't make a fair comparison and then tell us what it looks like. Instead, they sort of just try to deflect the argument initially without having done that work. That's where I came in. In fairness to them, I don't think the work could have easily been done before the internet. So we're talking about like the last 20 years that anybody could have possibly done this. But basically, there's 500 years of Protestant staying. There was very little evidence for these books without anybody actually digging in to find out what it is. Thanks to the internet, it is possible to do it. I did it. It's now available for everybody. And anybody talking about it just needs to clean up their argument. If you're a Protestant scholar, among those that I liked, you know, I don't expect them to sit there silently and convert to Catholicism out of this. I expect them to come up with a better explanation, but it's going to be an honest explanation based off honest facts. And the honest facts are that there are thousands of times that people in the early church said these things were scripture, etc.
All right. So you said you started with Matthew and Mark.
Yeah. The right way to read the Bible, in my opinion. Start with the Gospels because it explains why you care about the rest of it.
Right. But did you notice the correlation? Like the Old Testament has the New Testament concealed, and
oh yeah, and that's the fascinating part of how I read it with all those commentaries, because the commentaries are giving you different connections to something else, right? There's each one of them sort of showing you a different aspect or a different facet of the way that it's tied back to the old, the way it might be referencing these books, and then the way that it references other New Testament works. So part of what I put in my book are hundreds of times that Protestant scholars saw a connection back to these books rather than a connection back to the Protestant books, the merely Protestant books. And again, you can make whatever you want out of them to build from, but this is assembling those hundreds of times that Protestant scholars show me that. They show you some deep and meaningful things. They show you prophecies that are fulfilled, etc. I mean, that's something that you should want to know when you're making a decision. And again, you know, make your own decision after you know all the facts and all the evidence. But that's what I wanted to assemble for people, was to see all those things I was seeing across these hundreds of books. But it doesn't seem like anyone conveniently assembles them for somebody. So I put them all together for a reader.
Okay, so let me ask you this: do you have a favorite book? Everyone asks me that. So do you have a favorite book? And what do you think was the most challenging book to read? Or what had the most discrepancies?
Yeah, I love Susanna. I mentioned this on a show, and the guy said, well, of course, that's because you're a lawyer, and Daniel's being a lawyer. So it's a story about Daniel's childhood where he saves a woman named Susanna by doing a good piece of lawyering / prophesying. And anyway, I love that one. That's my favorite. And it just has a lot of wonderful life advice, because it shows you that when two people are telling you a conflicting story, the usual answer is that they're lying, right? And that's where, as you say, the challenging or aspects of them, you'll pick up a Protestant book which will tell you, well, look at all these mistakes in something like the Book of Judith, for example. And they'll say, look, there are inconsistencies, there's things that are counterfactual. Well, what do you do with that? And the answer is, I personally just look to Protestant scholarship, and I show this in the book. I do it with Judith and the others. Is you, in your own apologetics, explain away many discrepancies between Gospels, between Matthew and Mark, for example, or between the New Testament and the Old, and you give me the answers that I can quote back to you when we're talking about Judith. You have to be fair and consistent between whatever you see as a discrepancy or a problem and whether it's enough to disqualify a book, whether you're talking about the Protestant canon or these extra books. So I show that in this. And I quote, Martin Luther was one of many who would tell you right from the get-go, Judith was never meant to be authentic history like we think of a New York Times report on an event that just happened, etc. Judith actually says things that are clearly nonsensical to a Jew sitting there listening to it, such as, these people walked the things their entire lives. But Judith claims that an army marched 300 miles in 3 days. No army in history has ever gone 300 miles in 3 days. And no one would believe it when you actually walk everywhere in your own life. Like that's crazy. That's an insane distance. That's meant to tell you that Judith, and by the way, the name Judith is just means Jewess. Luther would tell you that was meant to be understood as a sort of divine fiction, like a divine poetry, a spiritual piece of fiction, kind of like the Book of Job, maybe, or Jonah and the whale, or other things that people talk about. Like, what are these things actual allegory? Is Jonah and the whale an allegory for death, or was it a real event with a real whale, etc.? People have explanations for these things. So my approach was just to go sort through those explanations and see how those apply to the Book of Judith, for example, and see whether Judith holds up. And my answer is it holds up, as do all of them.
Wow. So do you see the correlation in the Bible? When you read the Bible, can you see how it's coming to pass in current today?
Absolutely. And there's, having come late to the Bible and having read it so in depth so recently, I'm sort of amazed at lifelong Christians that don't see it. Like that there's sort of a cultural assumption that we live in a good time where you're safe, where being Christian is going to work out for you. And it'll teach your children morality and this, that, the other thing. The earliest Christians, this is the martyr church. These people joined a church knowing they would almost certainly be tortured and killed for their beliefs, and they converted anyway. That's what you find in the Bible. That's what I found in this reading into the earliest Christians, and in these books. 2 Maccabees is a tremendous story of martyrdom. There's a woman with 7 sons who watches all 7 sons be martyred in front of her for her beliefs. A very inspirational story that fathers in the early church, the earliest church, is preaching that book to people as they're about to be tortured and executed, right? 2 Maccabees is the example of hold to the faith, don't give up, all the way through martyrdom. And you'll even find like a lot of the famous earliest Christians by name, their last words are actually alluding back to 2 Maccabees. So all of this sort of tied together and ties into an image of like, I think we just lived in a bubble, and people need to get back to understanding that Christianity has been persecuted everywhere from time to time. And we are entering a phase where I think it's going to be persecuted in America very soon. I saw something by a Catholic priest, I think, who was saying, and I think he said this years ago, but he said, I expect to die in my bed. I expect my successor to die in prison, and I expect his successor to be executed. Like, that might be the future of Christianity in America, and we need to wake up to it. We have a chance to change it. I don't know if we can or can't, but these things come in cycles, and we seem to be entering a cycle of persecution.
Right on. And so tell me a little bit about, there's one book in the Bible that it's the only book in the Bible that promises a blessing. And that's That's Revelation.
Oh yeah.
And you know, and you know, for me, that was you know, it was hard to read, you know, because it's very um, descriptive and it's a fascinating book, but
Yeah. It's
but
hard to understand. It's not hard.
yes,
I didn't find it hard to read. I found it hard to understand.
well, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Comprehension. Yes.
Yeah. 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 No, in Revelation, several things. I mean, number one is that John gives you a vision of heaven. His vision alludes back to the vision of heaven given to you in the book of Tobit, one of these extra books, for example. And so he is basically showing you heaven looks just like this person, you know, the book of Tobit, the pre-existing book of Tobit. What does that mean for whether or not he saw Tobit as real, whether it was divinely inspired, et cetera? That's one of the questions I raise in my book. In addition, in Revelation, for example, we believe the number of the beast is 666, but the actual earliest documents existing, you know, remaining scraps of paper from the book of Revelation say 616. But the reason we think we're right about 666 and stick to it is that a particular early Christian named Irenaeus wrote a defense of the number 666, saying that is what John truly preached. And he writes this before these scraps of paper that we find the 616. And what he's saying is 616 was a mistake. 666 is the authentic thing from John. And the reason we trust that is Irenaeus learned from Polycarp, who learned from John. Polycarp's a disciple of John. Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp. He's one step removed from the real John. And we're basically getting that one step removed testimony of what the real John taught. So we accept that. Again, coming back to these other books, though, Irenaeus also tells you that John and the apostles gave us Baruch, which is one of these extra books. He says both things. Why would we accept them on 666, not accept them on Baruch, is one of those questions I have to be answered. And to get back to the martyr church and other stuff, it's crazy when you make the connections between all of these things. In the book of Revelations, John wrote a letter, or John has a letter from to the church in Smyrna. And the head of the church in Smyrna at the time that the book of Revelations is being written is Polycarp. And in the letter, it says, hold fast to the truth and you will, I think it's something like you will receive a crown in heaven. Polycarp is then martyred. So you're reading a letter to a man saying hold to the faith, and then you can see that Polycarp held to the faith. You can actually make a connection of who's being talked about. It's just one of those fascinating connections. It's just it's one thing to read the book of Revelations, it's another thing to read Polycarp's epistle, it's another thing to connect them and oh wow. It's sort of a haunting discovery or a haunting realization of how real that was to the people receiving that book, right?
Yeah. Do you have any Bible scholars that stood out that you're like, wow, this is a good one that maybe that you would?
Yeah, I pick on a guy named Mcwhorter. He wrote a book on the New Testament canon called Canon Revisited. It's a fantastic book. He is giving you the evidence for the New Testament to show you that we have the true New Testament, and arguing against people like Bart Ehrman and the Jesus Seminar and other people who claim that there were other gospels that we should be accepting, etc. And Kruger is showing you we have the authentic gospels. Those are the heretical fake gospels, and he's giving you the evidence for that. However, the problem and why I pick on Professor Kruger is he has one single footnote in which he explains away these books of the Old Testament, right? And in that, he makes a mistake. He forgot certain things, and it defeats this whole argument for the New Testament. That's kind of part of the inspiration of my book, is showing people this crossfire. If you're going to tell me that we have the evidence that shows the true, authentic New Testament came down from the apostles through these people like Irenaeus. Irenaeus received it from Polycarp, who received it from John. You got to deal with the fact that Irenaeus is also preaching Baruch. And saying that came from the apostles. It's the same testimony from the same guy in the same books. And Irenaeus is actually kind of the key of everything, because he is this one step removed from John. Irenaeus is the guy who tells us that we have the authentic version of Luke. There was a different version of Luke in the early time of the church. We believe that version was a shortened, cut up version of heretic. And this long form of Luke that we have is the correct version of Luke. We believe that because of Irenaeus, who, as I say, is also preaching Baruch. But anyway, as far as individual scholars in the modern era, in my book, I focus on the very best scholars, and Michael Kruger, as I say, did a fantastic job on the New Testament. As far as I know, he has the best-selling book of all time on the canon. Great scholar, and I quote him throughout the book favorably, and in some cases, as I say, pointing out that he made this mistake, and we all have to get back and realize that there is this conflict, this crossfire between what we say on the Old and the New Testaments.
Wow. Well, in kind of closing, a final message, for those people out there that maybe haven't gone into the Bible, or maybe haven't even given their life to Christ yet, but they're on the fence. What's your message to those people?
Yeah, that was the journey I was on. And I was a skeptic. I was a lawyer. These people were telling me, Jesus rose from the dead, and you roll your eyes, born of a virgin. Yeah, right. I was in that camp doing all that stuff. But as I say, to me, it's a two-pronged approach. It is one, understanding that our world is broken, and that the way that people try to explain our broken world doesn't really work when you read the psychology, the philosophy, etc. If you read both sides, read the Christian explanations. The Christian explanations are better, held together better, and then they're backed up by this evidence. I wouldn't believe, based on either one of those prongs alone. It is the combination of those two prongs. And that's what I found when I did the research. So I encourage everybody to do the research and get to the right place, because that is actually why you're alive, is to get to the right place before you die. So that you go to the right place after you die.
Right on. Well, Canon Crossfire, we can our viewers can watch it or get it on Amazon.
Yeah, it's on Amazon. My website, again, it's Canon of Scripture, so CANON, canoncrossfire.com. We'll take you to the cheapest books. I have audio books. There's a Kindle version on Amazon, or you can buy the paper version, hardcover, paperback versions of the book. I give you the cheapest prices if you click on the links in my website. It'll send you there. Also have a free preview on the website for people to read the book. And thanks to a donor, I'm able to give free copies out to seminarians. So you'll see a form for that on the website as well. If you're in a seminary, just shoot me a note and I can send you a free copy.
And tell us what your website is.
Canoncrossfire.com.
Okay.
CANON crossfire.com.
Canon Cross.
Yep. CANONCROSSFIRE.com.
CANON crossfire.com.
Yep. Got to spell Canon right. I think some high school kid quarterback has a Canon Crossfire with the two N's. So
Okay, so just one N, canoncrossfire.com.
Yep.
And
exactly.
Go to your website and go on Amazon. Thank you, Matthew, for getting on the Ark.
Thank you. God bless.
Yep. And thank you for watching Get on the Ark. And until next time, God bless you.